So when we're working with color in Illustrator, there's a couple of different, well, there's a lot, but there's a few different tips and tricks I want to show you. So I'm just going to make a couple objects here. So we have, let's say for argument's sake, this is our illustration. And it, by default, filled it with the white fill and a black stroke. We've talked a little bit about different stroke and corner options already this semester, but I'll show you some others. So again, we have the weight of our stroke, which you all are pretty familiar with, bless you. The caps. This applies to an open path. So if we were to have, let me make a copy of this quickly. Oops, as I hit the wrong button. So as we have an open path versus a closed path, you can see we have our rounded caps, our projecting caps, and as you can see as I'm going through these, nothing is happening with the shape on the left because it's a closed path, right? But then we have our corners, which apply to the closed paths, as you can see, and doesn't affect the open path, right? So we have the opposite. So you have your corners. You can have your rounded join or a bevel join, which gives you a little bit of corner options there. You can align the stroke. Again, we talked a little bit about this, aligning it to the center of your stroke, aligning it to the inside, or aligning it to the outside of your shape, rather. And then we have a few options. I'm going to go back to a regular corner here. You can have your dashed lines set up. And here it indicates the dash size and the gap size. So if you know if you wanted to make that smaller and you wanted your gap and your dash even all the way around, if for whatever reason you were going a little bit more stylistic and you did like a 10-point dash and then a 5-point dash, so you have bigger, smaller, so you can get into creating some patterns with this. Let's go to, I don't know, just for argument's sake. So you can kind of create interesting patterns and somewhat more stylized looks by using these gap and dash settings. Another setting here is these settings here where it preserves. It's usually defaulting to aligning the dashes, aligning the corners to the corner so that you actually have like an even corner, right? So it kind of aligns your dash around the shape. Whereas, oops, helps if I select it. This sort of lets it more, I guess naturally, for lack of a better word, fall. But you can see, your corners are kind of not the same at all, and the pattern doesn't flow perfectly within the object. And there's going to be times, or there might be times where you use that, and there might be times where you don't want it perfectly even, or there's times where you do want it perfectly even. So it's a relatively easy way to create a little bit of a stylistic look with using dashed lines. You also have different types of profiles, kind of like brushes, but not really. Width profiles for your strokes. And this is all shown if you don't see it under stroke, and if it's just the weight here. if it's just showing you like this basic information, you're going to click here and it'll say show options. Mine says hide because it's already shown. But again, you get down here, there's some different profiles you can pick if you want it to have sort of almost a brush-like look. And here you can have it flip along the path because it pretty much starts here, goes around and ends. And you can have that flip kind of like when we were playing with the flipping gradients, things like that. And again, all of your options pop up at the top of your screen as well. So let's say we're going to color this. I'm just going to make it some kind of obnoxious colors here. Switch to my stroke by hitting X, and I'm going to make it this sort of obnoxious cyan and red color. And then we'll bring in an ellipse. So let's say we have some shapes drawn. I didn't want it to remember the last thing. So we have our shapes drawn, right? You're going to color one of them, or if you've already colored some objects, or if you have another illustration that you want to bring in some colors for, what you can do is if you like these settings, I see some of you started playing with it already, we can use the Eyedropper tool. Is super, super, super handy. I use it all the time. Basically what the Eyedropper tool does is it duplicates pretty much whatever settings you have, whatever appearance settings you have for an object and places them into the object that you have selected. So for example, you have our black circle. Let's say for argument's sake we brought it in from somewhere else and we want it to have this appearance, right? We don't want to go back in. It basically saves you having to go back in and looking, okay, it's a weight of 4, it's this arrowhead, this profile with this, blah, blah, blah. So you don't have, so you don't have to keep redoing your settings. You can select your object, and then using the Eyedropper tool, I just hit the letter I to go to the eyedropper, or you select your eyedropper, and you literally just click on whatever object you have there. And again, because this is a circle, it's not really going to show us this profile that we have. The only thing you have to be careful of, which I do all the time, is when I'm so used to when you have your selection tool clicking off to deselect, that if you are in your Eyedropper tool and you click off into the artboard, it'll copy anything on the artboard. So it actually copies like the color of the free space, the color of the artboard, everything. This also comes in handy, super handy, not necessarily for this project, but this comes in super handy when working with text as well. If you have something already formatted in a document, you bring in some new text or you type in some new text, copy and paste new text from somewhere else. If you use that Eyedropper tool, it also will grab the appearance and the settings of all the settings in the text as well. So it's a nice way to be able to sort of copy settings without having to write down or go through settings, etc. So we're going to be working with the Eyedropper tool. I showed you some joins. The other thing that this project mentions, it's kind of interesting. It's a relatively, let's get rid of that because it's super bright. Let's get rid of the cyan. We'll go to a little bit more, a little bit more subdued color so we're not burning our eyeballs out here. We talk about, the book talks about creating a pseudo stroke, which is somewhat similar to, or the way they're referring to it, somewhat similar to a drop shadow. What they're going to do is, so instead of putting just a stroke on an object, you're going to copy and paste behind and then manipulate the object behind to sort of give it more of a hand-worked look. And they call it a pseudo stroke, I guess because it kind of looks like a stroke, but again, I feel like it's more of a drop shadow. So anyway, so we're going to copy this. I'm hitting my Command C. And then we're doing a paste and back. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill that with black. And we're not going to see it because it's behind, right? So I'm just going to nudge it a couple. So now you can see we have a more of a traditional even drop shadow, right? Even though it's very small. So what we're going to have you do for this assignment is with your direct selection tool, the white arrow, and being able to select one of the adjustment points, you can kind of grab it to adjust. That was a little too far, but you get the idea. So you kind of have this is kind of arbitrary. So you kind of have this more rough to nudge that a little bit. Kind of have this more rough looking hand drawn or hand worked stroke effect, so it looks a little bit more illustrative. Again, I think I would call this more of a drop shadow because I don't necessarily see it as a stroke. But anyway, so that's what they're referring to as the pseudo stroke, and you work with that a bunch with, especially with like the hat and things like that. But again, doing this with composing illustrations sort of allows you to get more of kind of a hand-worked feel, right? So it's less perfect, sort of less looks less machined, I suppose. You get the idea. But it allows you to, and again, it's somewhat arbitrary because it's going to be based on, how you feel it looks. You can match the book as best you can. But again, there's a little bit of room for playing around. But that's a pseudo stroke that they mentioned. So I wanted to talk about the stroke options, the kind of dashes that we put a stroke back on here just for fun. Working with dashed lines, working with the different types of profiles, etc., and then playing around with the pseudo stroke and some other options to give you a little bit more of a sort of hand-worked feel for this assignment.